Alright, this is the first lecture video for ecology populations. Ecology is basically the study of a large system of species that are living together in the same place at the same time. But to this unit, we're going to focus mostly on populations and what we can learn about them and how they change a little bit over time. So these are all the vocab words. We'll get into these then, so no worries with that. So let's just get started. What is population? A population is something we've been talking about for a little bit, but we're going to give it a little bit more time in the spotlight right now. Population consists of all the individuals of a species that live together in one place at one time. And it's really important to remember the scope or the setting of these populations because they can change drastically based off of how you define a place. Humans in the world, that's 7 billion plus at this point, whereas the population of Penn Manor High School is a little under 2,000. In addition, depending on what species you're talking about, you can see a lot of a very different amount of them living in a small spot. For instance, bacteria in your stomach will number in the thousands and millions because of how many bacteria actually live inside of our bodies. Whereas mountain lions in Pennsylvania might be a few thousand. Populations tend to grow over time since individuals tend to have multiple offspring over their lifetimes, and we'll start talking about how they grow and how they change. But before we do that, we're going to talk about some key features that make up a population, or how we define them. So firstly, there are three. There's three population characteristics. They are size, density, and dispersion. The population size is very simple. It's simply the number of individuals living in a population. Just how many. And we often track the health of a population based off of how many individuals there are inside that population. Small populations tend to be more vulnerable to extinction because the smaller numbers make it so that they are more likely to be affected by random chance. If there's a natural disaster, it's more likely they wipe them all out than a larger population. In addition, as populations tend to get smaller, they also tend to get more genetically uniform, which means there's less variations for natural selection to work with. So if something were to happen new, like the pepper moths experiencing darker trees, or a new disease, or new predators or something, it's less likely that a smaller population would be able to handle that new selective pressure. A second factor or characteristic we use to describe populations is population density. Uh, Density itself is how many things are packed into an area. So size does play a role in how dense a population is, but the area also plays a large role or capacity in that as well. Um, when you compare Lancaster to New York, the population density of New York is much, much higher because of the fact that they have so many people, but those people are living in a really small area. That makes them have a higher density than people living in Lancaster. We typically don't live in high-rise apartments like they do in Manhattan. Um, so their density is a lot more. If you look at that previous example of a population of how many bacteria live in your stomach, that's even more dense than Manhattan because of how many are packed into just your body. Um, and density has a lot of effects on a population and what makes them struggle to survive. A population with a large density tends to struggle for a lot of different reasons. Firstly, resources become more rare and harder to get. So you'll see a dense population struggling to find food and water. If they need a lot of space, that is also going to be a problem too, because too many things living in the same area that really reduces how much territory something might have. In addition, when you see large, uh, well, very dense populations, it also attracts predators. If you think about the birth or the hatching of sea turtle eggs along the beaches, those sea turtles, when they hatch, are extremely dense, and that is an opportunity for seabirds and other things like crabs or snakes or things to really get a really easy meal because there's so many things there. See the same thing with the migration of salmon. When there's large amounts of insects that are mating and flying around at the same time, density attracts more predators. And lastly, a large density also um, tends to spread disease a lot more easily than when we have a low density population. If you think about when you get sick during the year, it's likely always during school, because during school time, you come in contact with so many more people than you do over your summer vacation. It's also the same reason why you don't ever see pets typically get sick, like a cold or something, because your pets don't typically come in contact with a lot of other animals of their same species. For instance, my cat has never seen another cat before, so he's not going to get a communicable disease because he doesn't experience any interaction in which he could catch something from another cat. Um, but in addition, the low density also has some challenges as well. Low density, it's difficult for animals to find mates. So animals that are really spread out typically have trouble finding mates. Um, and that makes it a little more difficult for them too. The last kind of characteristic is dispersion. Dispersion is how individuals are arranged within space, and these can vary depending on what kind of strategy these animals or living things are kind of following. There are three types of dispersion factors, and in your notes there should be like little boxes that you can kind of draw this in. Uniform is the one on the left-hand side, random is the middle, and clumped is in the right. Uniform things are pretty much the rarest of dispersion types. This occurs when you have individuals who are mostly solitary predators that maintain large areas of territory for hunting purposes. So things like tigers, leopards, jaguars are good examples of uniform dispersion types because they are solitary, they defend territory, and they don't let other animals, even of their same species, inside their territory because that would jeopardize their survival. Random is actually quite common. You'll see that in things that just kind of like drift around and do whatever. So things like dandelion weeds tend to be random. A lot of plants are random. And clumped is another really common kind of dispersion type. You see this happening when any animals or plants or things tend to live in like familial groups. So things like wolves are pack hunters, they are clumped. People are clumped because we live in cities or houses. We aren't uniformly dispersed because I'm pretty sure your family does not disperse evenly throughout their territory. They don't make you sleep in the shed and your siblings sleep in a tent out in the yard. They don't do that. You live in the same little area. So humans are also clumpers too. But those are the three main types of dispersion and overall the three types of characteristics. Um, we also use population a lot in biology to do a lot of modeling because sometimes it's hard to go out into the environment and count up every single individual of a species. So we try to use math to kind of make things make a little more sense to us. Biologists and conservationists, people who track populations, use models to understand how um, the health of different kinds of populations. A population model is a simulated population that attempts to describe the key characteristics of a real population. Population models are used to help show the growth rates or the difference in births and deaths in a population. The mathematical formula is really simple for growth rates. Growth rates are simply equal to the births minus the deaths, all divided by the population size. So really easy to calculate. And there are really two growth models we'll see things following in real life. The first is an exponential model. In an exponential model, um, the growth of a species, it kind of looks like a J. And if you know your math, they follow a parabola. And in these things, the growth rate's constant, which means that as you multiply the population by that same growth rate, it changes by the same percentage. However, that means that the population itself, if you track the actual numbers, go up higher and higher and higher every year, or every period of time you track. Um, this model was followed by a lot of species. Bacteria are one, and very quickly, bacteria can go from a single bacterial cell. As it divides, it can get into the millions in over 10 hours if it's reproducing quickly. However, population sizes don't usually go unchecked, and we're going to introduce a vocab word that's really important called carrying capacity, which gets the variable k. This is the population size that is the maximum limit that an environment can sustain. So this is what an actual exponential growth curve looks like. You can see here how it starts off pretty slow, but as the population gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the population grows faster and faster and faster. Now, the other kind of growth model is a logistic model. When populations grow in the logistic model, they eventually deplete resources, causing population growth to slow. These kinds of populations experience something called density-dependent factors, which means that whatever factor is going on, the strength of it depends on how dense the species are. The logistic growth model is a population in which exponential growth is limited by a density-dependent factor, so we'll actually see the carrying capacity kind of come into play a bit more. This model expects birth and death rates to vary by population size, and eventually they actually kind of even out when the population is in kind of an equilibrium state. The population stabilizes around the carry capacity. So when you look at a logistic growth curve, it tends to look like an S. Or down here we have like a little bit of exponential growth, but as the population gets closer to this carry capacity line, this horizontal line here, the growth rates slow down and the population tends to even out. And there are a great number of animals that do follow logistic growth curves as well as some animals who also follow exponential growth curves. So in real life, organisms tend to follow either an exponential or logistic growth curve. And we'll break down all animals into two different kinds of categories. We have R strategists and K strategists. R strategists are organisms that experience exponential growth when there are favorable environmental conditions. The real limiting factors for these kinds of species are called density-independent factors. These are factors that will have the same strength regardless of how dense the population is. Weather is really a really good example of density-independent factors. These organisms have a short lifespan and reproduce quickly to take advantage of good breeding conditions. Examples being cockroaches, mosquitoes, fruit flies. And they tend to take advantage of summer months or food availability. They get really, really big populations really quickly, and then they disappear when the conditions change and they're less hospitable. The other type of strategy is a K strategist. K strategists, like us, follow a logistic growth curve, and we're usually around our carry capacity when we are having a healthy population. K strategists usually have a very long lifespan. They care for their young and have a slow maturing process. These organisms tend to include endangered species because the strategy is really good as long as you don't run into new selective pressures. And when we do have new stuff, which happens all the time because of humans, it tends to make other animals struggle. So